Good evening, and welcome to the Great Hall. I'm delighted to see so many of you here this evening. This Great Hall we are all gathered in has been an important destination for conversations about civic and societal issues in our city, in our country, and in our world since 1858. The dialogue and actions that shape us as a people are part of our DNA at Cooper, which is why I'm so proud of the program and panel that we'll experience together tonight. Monuments are at the center of the national debate about how we reconcile American history. How do we retell history to reflect what really was? Of even greater consequence is how we learn from that history to ensure a stronger and a more unified future. The Cooper Union is committed to convening the leading voices of our time around debates just like this one. And moving forward, we seek to play an even larger role by producing events like tonight's around important issues and stories as they're happening, for the purpose of being a catalyst for civil discourse and for positive social change. This idea is really Cooper's legacy. It dates to our founder, Peter Cooper. Peter Cooper actually sought to convene all of the US senators here in the Great Hall just before the outbreak of the Civil War. He believed that if he could just get them all into this one room, that the war could be avoided. Of course, that didn't happen. 150 years have passed, and clearly the work of civil rights in this country is far from finished. But it is in this spirit of Peter Cooper and in this historic space that we must continue to press, to learn, and to resolve the critical issues of our time. My thanks to Stephen Hillier, Cooper's director for the Irwin S. Channon School of Architecture Archive, for producing tonight's event and for absolutely everything that he does here. You'll meet him in a minute. Stephen is absolutely amazing. I know he's anxious to get the conversation underway, but before he does, I'll just say this. Tonight's discussion will be just one example of the insightful, thought-provoking, and hopefully inspiring public programming that we host at Cooper. If you enjoyed tonight, please come back and join us again and again. So many of our programs are free and open to the public, and you can find all of them on the events and exhibition page on our website, cooper.edu. Also, if you are interested in helping us sustain this caliber of public programming, please consider becoming a friend of the Great Hall. Information about this new opportunity is also on our website and in the program that you're holding tonight. Thank you again for joining us. I know this is going to be a compelling and riveting conversation, and now I give you Stephen Hillier.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to be brief because I think we're all here to hear about the discussion. I just want to first express a great deal of thanks to my colleagues at the Cooper Union, every individual who had a role, large or small, in making this event happen, especially President Sparks for her initiative to explore current topics through Great Hall debate, Deans Nader Tarani and Elizabeth O'Donnell in the School of Architecture, Acting Dean Peter Buckley and Professor Maren Stang in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and my colleagues Mindy Lang, Kim Newman, and Anessa Skolnikoff in the Office of Communications who are really instrumental in the outreach and promotion of this event. I'd also like to acknowledge the members of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, the Department of Parks, and the Department of Transportation who are with us tonight. So we're here for a discussion on an issue with deep layers of complexity, one that stretches over the arc of our nation's 241-year-plus history. Conversations and actions to remove Civil War monuments were well in motion before the events that took place in Charlottesville in April, but it was the planned removal of the statue of Robert E. Lee from its perch in Emancipation Park, which was recently renamed from Lee Park, that brought together hundreds of white supremacists and neo-Nazis over the course of 2 days, and which we all know led to the death of Heather Heyer. For me, this moment could not have been more clearly exposed as an ugly reality, that the deep gash of racial inequality in the United States is only growing, and the hatred, bigotry, and divisiveness being disseminated by our very leaders in large part are fanning those flames every day. And so in rejecting this kind of behavior and making clear that racism has no place in our culture, I find it important to remember that hate often stems from fear, and that fear often comes from a lack of knowledge or a lack of understanding. So with that thought, how do we move forward? Issues with gravity such as this should be discussed. They should be debated. We should disagree. I think that's a healthy thing for us to do and part of this discourse. But at the same time, more than ever, we need to do this with civility and respect. These are the basic tenets of any conversation that's difficult, and we owe it to each other as members of humankind to be just that, human and kind. So each one of us will be a part of the lifespan of this planet for just a brief moment. We stand on the foundations of the actions of those before us, and hopefully the marks we leave behind will lead to an illuminated future, one where our responses to the dark moments of our collective past will serve as beacons of common understanding. So, with that said, I would like to now wholeheartedly thank and introduce our distinguished panelists, Mabel O. Wilson, James Grossman, Michele H. Bogart, Julian LaVerdiere, and Brian Palmer, as well as our moderator, Mya Dosch. And a brief apology, I should have said Mya Dosch. Very briefly, a little bit about Mya. She is currently teaching a course entitled Monuments, Artist Interventions, and the Struggle for Memory in the Americas here at Cooper Union. She is a PhD candidate in art history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and the recipient of a Beinecke Fellowship for Graduate Study in the Humanities. Her dissertation considers artistic and architectural commemorations of the 1968 student movement in Mexico City, and from monumental sculptures to ephemeral embodied interventions. In addition to her work on Mexican art, Mya has also published and lectured on Holocaust memorials in the US, protest aesthetics, and the renovation of political prisons. Her work on Confederate monuments has been supported by a National Endowment for the Humanities seminar, and she has commented on the subject for WNYC. I'd like to turn it over to Mya with a great deal of thanks for her collaboration and thoughtfulness in making this event happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much to President Sparks, first of all, for prioritizing this kind of conversation, and also to Stephen for a really superhuman amount of work that he put in to make this come together in the last month or so. Now, as Stephen suggested, this is a time in which any kind of fictional divide between the violence represented by white supremacist monuments and the violence of white supremacy in the present has really spectacularly collapsed. Now, this violence has provoked fear and anxiety and self-reflection, but I also want to suggest that it offers a bit of possibility where we can choose to kind of reimagine our own built environment. And I'm very excited to be here tonight with 5 folks who are incredibly adept at both contextualizing Confederate monuments and also re-envisioning them anew. So just to give you a sense of the format for tonight's conversation, we're going to have about 5 minutes for each speaker to give very brief opening thoughts. And I posed just a couple of questions to the speakers in framing their thoughts. One of them was, what should be done with Confederate monuments? But also, what strategies, be they architectural, artistic, historical, activist, do you think are particularly effective in intervening in Confederate monuments? And then finally, what lessons from their own background and their own practice inform their thinking? So we're going to have those opening comments, and then we'll kind of open it up to a conversation among the panelists. And then in the last 15 or 20 minutes, we'll open it up to questions from the audience as well. So with that, we are incredibly pleased to have Mabel O. Wilson, Dr. Wilson, with us tonight. Dr. Wilson is closely involved in local discussions over public space, as she's a member of Mayor de Blasio's recently formed Advisory Commission on City Art, Monuments, and Markers, which is currently reevaluating many major monuments across the city. Dr. Wilson's own practice as part of Studio And is deeply and really inspiringly, I think, transdisciplinary. It weaves together history, design, and activism. And she also teaches architectural history, theory, and design at Columbia University, where she was actually teaching immediately before this event. And she's also a senior fellow there at the Institute for Research in African American Studies. Much of Dr. Wilson's extensive list of publications focus on space, politics, and memory in Black America. And she's currently working on a book manuscript entitled Building Race and Nation: How Slavery Influenced Antebellum American Civic Architecture. She was also one of the designers of the University of Virginia's Monument to the Enslaved Laborers, which is currently in development, and which should offer a poignant rejoinder to the white supremacist violence on the University of Virginia campus. So with that, it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Wilson.
I just want to say thank you, Maya, for that generous introduction, Stephen as well, and also President Sparks for welcoming us all. So I think it'll be a lively and interesting discussion, hopefully one that is educational. And I thought I'd maybe wear my hat of a historian as opposed to the designer, and I'm happy to talk about our design in Charlottesville, but as a historian, part of my project is to sort of think about the built environment. You know, as an architect, I left things there in the built environment, but also the fact that, you know, the things that we make often have afterlives, and to kind of consider, you know, kind of what does it mean, who has access, and who is often represented, and that's been a real driver for my work, my research design as well. So I just want to begin. This is called What is Your 4th of July? This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the first one. Okay, great. This, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and all of your political freedom, began the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass in an 1852 speech about the promise of liberty in the wake of its absence, slavery. Douglass also asks in his speech, what to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. Born in 1818, Douglass lived to see the end of slavery and the granting of full rights of citizenship to former slaves by the time he passed away in 1895. Douglass was also keenly aware of the potential of the new technology of photography to circulate his image into every nook and corner of the nation in order to dispel degrading stereotypes of Black men and women that had circulated widely. As a result, his visage was well known to many Americans, both Black and white. Upon his death, residents in Rochester, New York, the town from where Douglass published the anti-slavery newspaper, The North Star, for several years, erected a monument to the great orator, publisher, and activist. This monument, an 8-foot-tall likeness in bronze by sculptor Sidney W. Edwards, stood for many years in one of the city's main public spaces in front of the New York Central Rail Station. In their award-winning American Negro exhibit at Paris's Exposition Universelle in 1900, T.J. Calloway and W.E.B. Du Bois included a maquette of the Douglass Monument among the various books, patents, photographs, and sociological studies that represented the progress of Black life in the United States at the turn of the 20th century. For Du Bois, the American Negro exhibit represented an opportunity to exhibit the scope of the Black Atlantic world and its contribution to world history to an international audience in the ideologically charged public spaces of the World Exposition. Du Bois would describe their monumental endeavor as, quote, an honest, straightforward exhibit of a small nation of people picturing their life and development without apology or gloss, and above all, made by themselves. In a way, this marks an era in the history of Negroes of America, end quote. Now, the American Negro exhibit traveled to other world's fairs. It stopped in Buffalo, New York, at the Pan American Exposition in 1901, where the maquette of Douglass anchored the prominent corner of the exhibition. Later that same year, the American Negro exhibit also was on view inside the Negro Building at Charleston's Interstate and West Indian Exposition. Outside of the Spanish colonial-style Negro Building, Bradford Gilbert, the New York architect commissioned with the design of the fair's main pavilion, had planned to install the Negro Group, one of 4 sculptures in homage to the 4 racial groups that had first settled the region: the Huguenot, which was a reference to the colonial whites; the Aztec, which represented Spanish settlers; the Aborigine, these are his terms, which represented Native American; and the Negro. In the final version, artist George A. Lopez carved a stalwart negress in full stride, balancing a basket overflowing with cotton pickings on her head. She stood adjacent to a crouching blacksmith hammering away at his anvil, his well-worked sinews telling a life dedicated to manual labor. Rounding out the trio sat a jovial banjo player, smiling and strumming away on his cherished instrument. This animated, larger-than-life trio possessed distinctly African features, negating the historical reality that many blacks in the South, because of the centuries of rape of enslaved women by their white male masters, possessed decidedly Euro-American features. Black residents protested against the erection of the offensive statue. But the white fair administrators, confident and proud of their homage to Negro progress, or at least how they gauged it, simply relocated their gift to a more prominent site on the fairgrounds before the commencement of the fair. Seen by even more visitors in its new location, jurors awarded Lopez's depiction of the Negro race a silver medal in the sculpture category for fine arts. The Douglass statue was the first monument dedicated to African Americans in the United States. This is 1895. This achievement was 30 years after emancipation. Even then, it was an unusual civic gesture, given how tactics of Jim Crow segregation in the South, but also stealthy racially discriminatory practice in the North, curtailed Black America's right to access public spaces, to travel freely, to cast a vote, and a host of other privileges that had now been unconstitutionally denied. In fact, before the 1990s, only a handful of monuments and memorials to and about African Americans, many dedicated to Civil War soldiers, were erected in public spaces around the country. As I have shown in my book, Negro Building, the ability to permanently claim space in the nation's public spheres was ruthlessly policed. And therefore, temporary public spaces, what I have called counter-public spaces, like the Negro buildings and the eventual emancipation expositions, were one of the few public spaces, because they were temporary, where Black Americans could mount presentations of Black history and culture. So while Black Americans had full rights after emancipation, to paraphrase Douglass's query, what to the African American is your 4th of July? In light of this historical exclusion from public representation, and not just politically, but the material representation, and efforts to use degrading and intimidating representations in those public spaces to keep Blacks dutifully in their place, as the Negro group in Charleston represented, how do we think about the current condition of public space? And we can talk also, there was this monument called the Black Mammy Monument in Washington, D.C., right around this time, which is another kind of loathsome example. How do we understand our current landscape of American history in those public spaces, not as time-lit and transcendent representations of Americanness, but also recognize the roles that monuments and memorials have played in the historical manifestation of domination, discrimination, and whiteness, and how those vestiges continue to resonate today? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. And our next panelists Dr. Jim Grossman is another eminent scholar on African American history and urban space. And he is visiting us from Washington, D.C., where he's the executive director of the American Historical Association. And this is an organization that has really taken a lead, I believe, in fostering dialogue and offering historical context on race, space, and violence after Charlottesville. Dr. Grossman has also taught at the University of Chicago and the University of California, San Diego, and he's the author of several books, including The Land of Hope, Chicago Black Southerners and the Great Migration, and A Chance to Make Good, African Americans from 1900 to 1929. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Grossman.
Thank you, Maya. And I've never been here before, and this is quite some privilege. And I want to thank everybody from Cooper Union who made this happen and who thought of inviting me. I'm going to jump very quickly into the main question. What to do with Confederate monuments. And I should note, however, that it's not just about monuments. You have to consider the magnitude of this problem more broadly. There's no shortage of Confederate memorials in general. For approximately half a century after Reconstruction, memorial associations, especially the Daughters of the Confederacy, which had as many as 100,000 members at one point, erected more than 1,000 Confederate monuments across the South, most notably in front of county courthouses placed there strategically and purposefully. By one count, there are now more than 1,500 monuments in 31 states as far north as the state of Washington. And this does not include, and this is why I say it's not just the monuments we think of, this doesn't include battlefields, markers, plaques, cemeteries, but there's actually more. North Carolina is the only state with a comprehensive inventory, and it turns out to have 300 Civil War monuments by itself. Not only monuments, there's a broader context important to understanding even just the monuments. As of last summer, and I know the number has changed, which I think is a good thing, there were roughly 50 to 75 schools named after Robert E. Lee, including in San Diego and Long Beach, California. This is not just a Southern problem. 11 named after Jefferson Davis, and 4 named after Stonewall Jackson, who famously declared that slavery was ordained by God. 7 schools named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. Overall, 109 school names for prominent Confederates, 27 of them majority African American. A substantial portion of these schools were named in the mid to late 1950s. So it's clearly not about the Civil War. I hope most of you will remember that or know that the mid-1950s immediately follows Brown versus Board of Education, which is why these schools were renamed. And it's not only schools. The Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stevens, has a county in Georgia and one in Texas, not to mention a statue in the United States Capitol. Stevens is the author of the famous Cornerstone speech, where he made it very clear that the Confederacy was not about magnolias, mint juleps, or the various other things that we've seen. The cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. One of the things Stevens was concerned about was that he felt that Jefferson had not understood this. But then again, Stevens is not the only man to have committed treason on behalf of the right to own other human beings and yet be honored with a statue in the United States Capitol. Robert E. Lee has a statue, Jefferson Davis, and a few others. As a historian, I can't think about what to do with the monuments without first asking why they're there and how they got there. They were built at first The ones immediately built after the Civil War were actually different from the ones you think about. The ones immediately built after the Civil War were actually built to honor ordinary soldiers, the war dead, the standard thing you think of. But most of them were built between 1895, mid-1890s, and World War I. Less to commemorate the war than to celebrate the values and institutions for which white Southerners later claimed to have fought. An order that could be dressed up in the clothing of states' rights and a culture of honor and even chivalry. But fundamentally, it was about white supremacy. Having overthrown Reconstruction, largely through terror and chicanery, white Southerners needed everyday reminders to black Americans of their place, a place both defined and symbolized by the emerging Jim Crow regime and enforced by disfranchisement and the legal mechanisms of segregation, along with the occasional lynching. Conversely, the monuments spoke to white Southerners as well, to unite white Southerners around the war as a symbol of regional honor and defense. And also, again, this is probably the reason for the move from ordinary soldiers to generals and high political officials, which was to remind poor white Southerners of their place, that the important people were the ones who were sitting at the top. Later, Confederate monuments would be built to unite white Southerners and Northerners in opposition to various moments in the second half of the 20th century, such as President Truman's Integration Order, the Dixiecrat Rebellion in 1948 at the Democratic National Convention, and Brown. For example, the statues that I think most of you saw in the news removed by order of Baltimore's mayor in the middle of the night a few months ago were erected in 1949. And you will have to struggle very hard to think of a Civil War anniversary for 1949, never mind Lee or Jackson's birthday. But it is the year after Dixiecrats. So what to do with them? They weren't put up to honor patriots. They honor, for the most part, men who committed treason. And what I want to emphasize is that people have said that if we take these things down, we're erasing history. And that's something to be taken seriously. We can discuss it in our conversation, what it means to erase history. It's important that we preserve historical documents. So what I want to suggest is only one possibility. I think there are many things to do. And what I've argued in the past is that communities should decide. And the only thing that I'm going to insist on is when communities decide, they should have a historian at the table. But here's one solution. This is Fallen Monument Park in Moscow, where after the fall of the Soviet Union, people took down Soviet-era statues and they hauled them off into a park. Is this going to... It's not going to move. Okay, you can see among the art historians who's a foreigner here. Okay. So this is Fallen Monuments Park in Moscow, and there's something very similar in Budapest. If this is bigger, you could see that these are the labels at the bottom of the plaques next to the monuments in Fallen Monuments Park. So this was their solution. Just haul them off. Now, this is one of the conundrums of Confederate monuments. People who have said you can't take the monuments down point to Stone Mountain and they say, what are you going to do, blow up Stone Mountain? So one possible solution, looking at what the Russians did and what the Hungarians did in dragging monuments to the south side of Budapest, is to think, a few people have suggested that we take all the Confederate monuments in the state of Georgia, haul them all off to Stone Mountain, create a Civil War outdoor museum, do proper interpretation, and then think about how we can do similar things in other parts of the country. One possibility, what I'm suggesting is there's lots and lots of creative things that we could be doing here. It's not a matter of leaving them up or taking them down.
Thank you very much, Jim. It was nice to have both some context on history and this kind of very productive potential intervention. So our final urban design historian then is Dr. Michele Bogart, who has been really a key preservationist voice in the local conversation over Confederate memorials, as her comments have appeared in the New York Times and several other periodicals. Dr. Bogart is a professor at SUNY Stony Brook University, where her scholarship focuses on the social history of public art and urban design. She's also the author of several award-winning books on public space, including Public Sculpture and the Civic Ideal in New York City and The Politics of Urban Beauty, both of which have won awards. She's also helped to shape our own public space here in New York City as part of the Art Commission of the City of New York. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Bogart. Just one more.
Okay, good evening. This is not a Confederate monument. This is this is a civic virtue by Frederick McMonnies, which you see in a version. You see it where it used to be in Queens in Kew Gardens. It's now in Greenwood Cemetery, minus the fountain basin. But I just want to start with that because I want to just briefly put my own remarks into some kind of context of myself. I've studied the history of American monuments for some 30 years, and I've had to defend the choices of my objects of study for much of that time, for one reason or another, either because of their stylistic properties. People would say, you know, they're academic, they're conservative, or because of the political or ideological meanings attributed to them. They're imperialist, they are sexist. So I began simply trying to find ways of understanding them art historically without feeling guilty about it. Over time, however, I've kind of increasingly become involved in struggles to protect them, and this is one work that I was involved in trying to protect. And my desire to do this has arisen from the particular sociological, art historical perspectives I've chosen to take. One's focused on patronage, process, and place. In my work, it matters who were the sculptors, the particular sponsors, the professional networks, the organizational and institutional structures, and the specifics of place, locale, and urban politics. These specifics, when uncovered through archival study, help illuminate motivation, action, and meanings. In my view, monuments are the physical, aesthetic culmination of diverse and unpredictable human actions. They are dynamic, aesthetically charged, and meaningful imprints of the socio-biographical on place. They are as well about politics and power. But all of the other investigations, I think, are needed to understand the actual nature of those politics and power. And the analyses demand examination of evidence that must include the physical object in situ, outdoors, and the somatic impact of all of that. Now, I totally understand the revulsion that many people have towards Confederate monuments, especially in the wake of the barbarous murders in Charleston and Charlottesville. But unlike many, I fervently disagree that removal of these works is either a constructive response or a solution to the larger problem. Statues and monuments are not the same as Confederate flags, which are static, two-dimensional, and interchangeable graphic symbols. Monuments are three-dimensional historical artifacts that exist within a specific built environment of architecture, landscape design, and public space, and all of that is part of the historical record. I do not share the now prevalent view of monuments as simply symbols of white supremacy. And I do not share the assumption that monuments merely signify as celebrations, venerations, and validations of their subjects, like Robert E. Lee. That the meanings we attach to them today as racist symbols of white suprematism are their only meanings, and that they should somehow continue to represent those meanings to people now. These works are, of course, about race and Jim Crow, but I contend that monuments are about more than that. We don't need to whitewash their unpleasant aspects, but we do need to think about them in more complicated ways that take account of both their physical and aesthetic attributes and the way that those attributes were both shaped and the circumstances that motivated them, and articulated a range of meanings. To embrace the tear them all down idea is to oversimplify the past insofar as it levels all the works to the same thing and in effect dematerializes them. So to respond directly to the questions that were asked of us, I believe that nothing should be done to these monuments. More research should be done on each one, both to flesh out the histories of production and to tease out opinions or actions of African Americans. So Dr. Wilson's research here is crucial. Native Americans and others previously ignored need to be considered in all that, and historians of African American subjects have much to contribute here. Let's try to round out the story. Monuments on site should serve as instruments for primary and secondary school education, as quite a few Americanists in higher education are already doing. This enterprise should be taken farther to include grade school kids. Bring kids to the site. Learn how the bronzes and marble sculptures are made, how decisions are made about placing them, about the work of art, about the semiotic work of form and style and iconography in conjunction with explication about the subject, be it the hero, villain. Yeah, who was Christopher Columbus? Why was he considered important in 1892? Why did people in New York want a huge column and statue of him there? How did it get put up? Who was responsible? I mean, who specifically was responsible? How did that space come to be called Columbus Circle? Did the monument come first, or did the name come first? What kinds of materials were used, and how has the city dealt with the maintenance of such a huge work? What's the significance of the fact that there is another large memorial right there in Columbus Circle competing with it? What's that one? For Charlottesville, tell people about Paul Goodloe McIntyre, who endowed the funds for the Robert E. Lee Memorial. Who was he exactly? And those who worked with him, like W.O. Watson and the highly respected architect Walter Dabney Blair, and sculptors Henry Schrady and Leo Lentelli, who besides sculpture scholars can talk about their significance. What personal as well as ideological motivations did McIntyre have for commissioning prominent artists and architects to develop a bold new city beautiful design section in Charlottesville, including a high Beaux-Arts style statue of Lee and 3 other works in 1917, no less, and for endowing professorships and buildings at the University of Virginia? What was Charlottesville as a city like in 1917 beyond the reality of Jim Crow? What conflicts arose in the effort to do all of this? These are just a few simple matters that people would benefit from, certainly me, would benefit from knowing more about. I'm not saying that the works did not and do not have imperialist or racist meanings on some level in certain cases, but that they do not signify just that in all cases, under all circumstances, all of the time, and for everybody, including members of the affiliation groups in question. I'm saying that they can and do have meanings that transcend race and can, in fact, enrich our lives, but which we can only grasp if we grapple with them right where they are. Because the works themselves in situ and with their full aesthetic integrity intact are the crucial evidence that we need in order to be able to make intelligent, informed investigations and assessments. And municipalities that accepted these works on presumption that they'd be permanent have an obligation to maintain them and constructively deal with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bogart, and thank you for the counterpoint to Jim's. I think they dialogue really in interesting ways. Next up, we have our very own Cooper Union graduate, Julian LaVerdiere, who graduated here from Cooper Union in 1993 and then went on to receive his MFA from the Yale School of Architecture's sculpture program. And Julian is known for his September 2001 work on the design team that created the iconic Tribute to Light, which is the now annual memorial to the victims of 9/11. He received the Cooper Union Urban Visionary Award that following year and was inducted into the Cooper Union Alumni Hall of Fame for his work. His current design practice focuses on environments, sets, and graphic design for print advertising and film. He's also had solo exhibitions of his own metaphysical monuments and mobile monuments, and has lectured on global approaches to public art. So it's a pleasure to welcome back Julian Lovett.
Thank you. I hope there's some students here because I only ever sat on that side, and it's very daunting beyond this. I guess the thing that this panel had led me to think more about, which I thought a lot about when working with the Tribute in Light, was that that was a response to an act of destruction. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about what that act of destruction meant or what it is. And it's interesting, your points about the importance of respecting and preserving these works, but maybe that act of destruction made me wonder, is there such a thing as a sanctity in art? You know, what makes something that special that it deserves to live in perpetuity? I mean, no building lives that long. So maybe there's an art to destruction. You know, maybe there is a symbiotic relationship. Maybe you need to have destruction to have art. You need to have forest fires to have forests regrow. You need revision or renovation. And so this, I came across this term that was interesting. So here, okay, I have 5 minutes, so I'm going to put 2,000 years into 5 minutes. Give me. What I thought was interesting about what the Roman Empire would do is that they would, when somebody had fallen out of favor, they would destroy them, either try to completely erase them, like here's a family portrait without a face. Here's a coin that had 2 faces, but now it only has 1. And here's, a stele that had that name of Goethe that was erased. But it wasn't just the erasure. Sometimes, erasure's not going to work. Maybe it's a stamp from the state saying, we've just cut off his head. Or a slash to the face. And the interesting thing about coinage is that coinage is going to go throughout the realm after it's been damaged. So it's a message. You've got the work of art, and then you've got a commentary. So this is not uncommon. This is sort of like a cyclical thing. I think we're like humans are inherently destructive creatures. We like to destroy as much as we like to and build things, and you need that constant cycle. And so, the Romans were sacked 6 times, not just by the Visigoths, Vandals, and barbarians. But what's interesting about the way they would go about sacking things is they would carve a little crucifix in the head just to sort of not just knock the nose off, but give it a little 1-2 punch. And there's many different ways in which this sacking is portrayed, but what's interesting is the romance of the sacking is happening, during periods of revolution. So people are interested in the fall of Rome when they want to build republics. It's sort of like almost a contradiction in terms. The Calvinists didn't care much for the Catholics, and Protestants didn't care for them either, and that certainly we all know very well. Sorry, this is a little bit of an art lecture, but it comes, bring it right up to the present. The American Revolution is kind of fascinating because, becomes a tradition in monument toppling. I mean, it's not just like some kind of spontaneous angry mob. They're like, hey, this works. We have to do it. It's like an advertisement. It's a PR action. It's as much PR as the monument itself, because these monuments are kind of schlocky. I mean, let's not sort of kid ourselves. These things usually are pretty terrible. Like coinage, I mean, some of them, there's some virtuosos out there, and they get the big commissions, but, come on. So, you got revolutionaries, toppling King George. You've got Louis being toppled 10 years later by the French. And then one of these French revolutionaries in here becomes a leader. Napoleon pulls down the obelisk that represents the, history is failing me, the Prussians won a little bit of something over King Louis. He made a monument. Napoleon's pulling it down because he doesn't want to celebrate that. And then, not so long, the Vendome column comes down, and on top of the Vendome column was Napoleon. So it kind of, sort of karma, I guess. So here we have an interesting bit of 20th century that is very prescient now, and what to do once your monument is destroyed and dismembered, and you have this carnage. You have these torn apart, figures. I mean, it's like drawing and quartering somebody, but it's cathartic. And if it's covered by the press, maybe that helps quell, and maybe that's like artificial bloodshed. Maybe it's good to let everybody have it at it with the monument, and maybe they'll spare each other. But the interesting thing about what they're doing in former Soviet republics is that they'll take the bits and they'll leave them. And here you have Stalin's boots restored on top of the original monument. They've stripped all of the other figures, and instead of having limestone, they've done brick. So it's sort of not so fancy. And I think that's kind of an interesting way, leaving that empty pedestal, but empty pedestal maybe, as you said, you tell the story, but tell the story of the revolution as well. So here we have, all these guys, but these guys, other than that one fabulous moment where the college students pulled down the Confederate soldier and he got smushed, because you could see just how crappy that sculpture was. It was half lead anyway. They don't do that if they're built properly. But all of these dismantlings are done by the state. So it's different. You're not letting your public have a revolution. You're sneaking them out at night, or you're doing them after we've all sat around at a table and decided whether or not it was kosher. I mean, it's the problem is then what happens? Who's the revolutionary? Is the state the revolutionary? Does that make the monuments prisoners of the state? And so, oops, wrong one. So here's the question: what to do with your political leader that's fallen out of favor? And exile is sort of something that comes up. Okay, I've got 1 minute left. All right. So Napoleon is a fine example. They exile him to St. Helena. I say, let's exile all of our Confederate sculptures to the appropriate place, to a POW camp, maybe a historic one that's already a monument unto itself. This is one of the most fabulous, unknown POW camps ever existed. It's giant. It's bigger than the Pentagon. And you could store all of those thousands. You could put an entire platoon. You could put but how many of them? You said 2,000 of them? And you'll still have room. Okay, or closer to home, because that's way far away and it's subject to hurricanes. But right here in our own backyard, we also have a fabulous POW camp ready to take prisoners that is also a respected, monument unto its own. And it would put them back into context, because the trouble is that we've never finished the war. Why are these guys heroes again? The wars, they lost. So maybe if they, rather than squishing them and destroying them, defacing them, put them back into the context, that these were, not the winning side. They weren't the glorious heroes. Now, I think this would be my first choice of all those islands. This little island had a lesser-known Civil War POW camp, and it also houses a really great Civil War monument. So it's already started. So this has got the best Civil War monument ever built that's not celebrated for being a Civil War monument. Because when it was conceived on the finality of the Civil War. It was conceived to celebrate emancipation, and it took 30 years to make. So by the time it rolled around, it was going to be recognized as something to celebrate the centennial of our revolution, but not emancipation. The earlier designs, she was holding chains in her hands. She was stomping chains that were falling off the pedestal. There was a pedestal design where you could see all of that activity. But, this is as monuments go, they're not just the work of a single visionary artist. They're always a conglomerate. So these chains, they exist, but the pedestal was built so tall that until, you have these types of photos, they're not regularly seen. Frankly, I never really knew that she was shackled. Both feet, broken chains. And so, the beauty of that gesture was that she was to be stomping on these broken chains. So why not put all the Civil War soldiers, the prisoners, at her feet? Let her stomp them out.
Thank you very much, Julian, for that intervention and those kind of exciting possibilities for local means of dealing with Confederate statues.
I think I broke it.
And our final panelist tonight is Brian Palmer, who's visiting us from Richmond, Virginia, where he is based as a freelance photojournalist. His eminent career has included work as the Beijing bureau chief for U.S. News and World Report, as a correspondent for CNN, and he's also undertaken 3 media stints in Iraq alongside U.S. Marines. Now, as a freelance journalist, Palmer's current interests include a documentary entitled Making the Ground Talk, which is on a black freed persons community that the U.S. military displaced during World War II. He's also working on a photographic research project on the neglected, overgrown African American burial grounds around Richmond, which I think he's going to show us a little bit in his presentation today. So join me in welcoming Brian Palmer.
I thought I broke the microphone. I was trying to do a little Michael Jackson thing, but that didn't work. So, just a preface. I live in Richmond, Virginia. I have a lot of conversations with a lot of people, including people who defend the monuments, Sons of Confederate Veterans, and various folks. So that's the context from which I'm coming at this from. This is the Confederate Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Libby Hill Park, which is about a 10-minute walk from my house, or even faster if the puppy is pulling. It was unveiled in 1894. Other things happened in 1894. Samuel Wood was lynched in southwestern Virginia in Scott County. The United Daughters of the Confederacy was founded in 1894. The United Confederate Veterans celebrated their first anniversary. So these are two groups that were really quite prominent in this program to erect Confederate monuments across the country, not just across the South. Also in 1894, in Virginia, the Walton Act was passed. So that was the second of 3 legislative successful attempts to disfranchise African Americans. So the Walton Act made it illegal to put symbols on ballots, which meant that if you were illiterate, as were a fair number of poor and African American people, you could not participate in the process of voting. So this is a more recent image that I took in about 180 years after that first picture was taken. The Jefferson Davis Monument in Monument Avenue just happens to be very close to my first apartment in Richmond. It was unveiled in 1907, around the same time as the Jeb Stuart Monument, there were 5 Confederate monuments on Monument Avenue in Richmond, which is a beautiful boulevard, a National Historic Site on the National Historic Register. One of the primary issues that I'm concerned about is what is inscribed in these monuments. Much of it is demonstrably untrue, and I think we can get into that. We can sort of talk about the substance of this. But the anchor of Monument Avenue is the Robert E. Lee statue, which was unveiled in 1890. It was a huge gala event, about 10,000 people attended. So it was a big deal. So as I said, the drive to erect monuments in that second phase at the end of the 19th century was very much driven by United Confederate Veterans, the UDC, and their allies. Many of these people were either friendly with the elite or they were the elite themselves. So this was an ideological project. The UDC was founded essentially to rewrite history and to represent the Civil War as this battle between brothers. And one of the tenets that they propounded was that African Americans liked slavery, that slavery had a civilizing influence on African Americans. So think about that. As African Americans are trying to exercise their constitutional rights that they won by force of arms, right? We had about 180,000 African American soldiers and several thousand African American sailors. These people are erecting monuments that are part of a larger ideological project. So you have the 1902 Constitution. That's where we get our literacy tests and poll taxes, and that disenfranchises effectively 90% of African Americans. So many of the people active in the monument erection movement were these very same people in the UDC and in the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So folks are aware of the recent resistance to the monuments. This is a recent September rally that was called by a group called the New CSA. They managed to call out about a dozen people. The counter-protesters came out in force, hundreds and hundreds of people, to protest against the protesters themselves. So we know about the recent resistance, but we don't know about the contemporary resistance. John Mitchell Jr. was the editor of the Richmond Planet, the African-American newspaper of Richmond. It was anti-lynching. He was threatened with lynching, and he opposed giving public money for the unveiling of this statue. Mitchell also sat on the city council, and he and white radical Republicans voted against funding the unveiling. He did this under threat of physical violence. People, someone sent him a noose in the mail, but he opposed it. They lost that battle. But my point is that the statues are there through a profoundly undemocratic process. Moreover, through this ideological mission called redemption, which is to claw back the rights won by African Americans during the Civil War and in Reconstruction, and to strip them down once again to their labor, to our labor. That's what the monuments, I believe, represent. So 1996, the 6th monument on Monument Avenue is added, Arthur Ashe. The best to say about that is probably nothing. But 2017, this statue to Maggie Walker was dedicated. Now that first statue, it did have some African American support, but again, this was an official thing kind of imposed on Monument Avenue. We have to have a Negro up there, so let's choose Arthur Ashe, who's a Richmond native. This was more city, community, and Maggie Walker is an absolute civic powerhouse. The first African American woman to open a bank in the country. She was a national leader, she was a local leader, she was a philanthropist. That's something. And yet we still face a problem. There is affirmative action for dead Confederates in the state of Virginia and in other states across the South, but in particular in Virginia. So this is a monument at Oakwood Cemetery. Oakwood is a public cemetery, but this particular section is maintained by the Sons of Confederate Veterans through a memorandum of understanding with the city of Richmond. They get money from the state. So each year since 1923, the state of Virginia has been giving a certain allotment to the United Daughters of the Confederacy to dispense to other memorial associations around the state to take care of Confederate graves. That would not be a problem, except the money only goes to Confederate cemeteries. Now, a new piece of legislation was passed this year to help neglected historic African American cemeteries. This is my wife, Erin, working at East End Cemetery where we volunteer. But it's a pittance, and it does nothing to change that item in the Code of Virginia that allots a certain amount of money every year to Confederate graves. Again, that hit the books in 1924, the same year as the Racial Integrity Act. The same, this was a period of domestic terror. African Americans could not participate because they were disfranchised. In terms of positive solutions, I love some of the ones that I've heard today. This is a display at the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. These jars represent or are soil recovered from lynching sites. So I was able to go to the Alabama-Mississippi border and recover soil from the rough area where Ed White was lynched. This will be displayed in Brian Stevenson and E.J.I.'s Memorial to Peace and Justice. We should also be talking about the 328-page report that Charlottesville Blue Ribbon Commission came up with. They're talking about dealing with their monuments in the context of all of the sites, African American sites, and various cemeteries that need attention. But you have to deal with the fundamental problem, and I think we've identified it. In my view, they do represent the white supremacist impulse. People hang on to that. That's what they're protecting. I know, I've talked to many of them. That's the problem, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. So with that, I want to facilitate a little conversation before we turn it over to audience questions. And one of the questions that I want to return to, because I think it's a really provocative question, is something that Julian mentioned, which is this question of, is there sanctity in art? Which I think Michele kind of argues that, if I understood you correctly, there is some kind of sanctity in art beyond, in arguing that there's other meaning beyond race in these monuments. But then Brian's comments made me think, is the sanctity coming just from funding and maintenance, and is that what is creating sanctity in some ways? So yeah, I would love to hear what other people think about this idea of sanctity and how that relates to saving or tearing down or destroying Confederate monuments.
One quick thought was that one of the problems with the monuments is not just, never mind who sculpted them. Like the Statue of Liberty, for instance, you've got the sculptor and then you've got the pedestal maker, and those are two different operations. Firstly, what's interesting about this fallen monument park in Moscow is that all of the figures, if they are still in one piece, are no longer on their original pedestals. They're not above eye level. They're below eye line. They built walkways so that you can look down upon them. And maybe you're shaming them. Maybe that's not really a respectful sculpture park, but it's better than dust. So I think that the thing that's important is to take these characters off their pedestals, because no matter how well you can recontextualize it and how well your social studies teachers will try to re-educate, these things are still sexy PR objects. Mm-hmm. You've got an 8-foot, 10-foot bronze guy on a horse with this incredible brow, and he's gesticulating. It's like nobody until they're an adult can look at any of that with any perspective. It's seduction. It's like crack.
I think that I think Julian has an important point here is in terms of the looking up. When a community makes a decision to put a statue, a monument, a memorial, the community is stating that this is a person worthy of honor or a cause worthy of honor. And so the question is, have these individuals who are being honored in these statues ever been worthy of honor? And has the full community had an opportunity to have the conversation? When the UDC put these up, they put up the money, they lobbied the legislature. A good part of the community couldn't participate in the conversation. So for me, that's why the slippery slope argument doesn't make any sense. Yes, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were slaveholders, but they did things that are worthy of honor. I'm willing to tolerate a statue of Robert E. Lee at Washington and Lee College, which Lee basically saved. He is worthy of being honored by that institution for what he accomplished. Stonewall Jackson is being honored for one thing and one thing only, for fighting for the right of people to own other people. And the same thing with the others. So that's where I think we can be asking the question. It's not an aesthetic question. It's a question of culture, that we make a decision to honor people, and that decision ought to be a democratic decision made by a community.
That's now, but the thing is that these monuments were not, they were not created, commissioned, designed, and with what we might have in mind back then. I mean, in other words, back then they weren't aware of what we might think right now, and we don't know that 50 years from now people are going to think the same way we do. And so one issue I have is, who are we now to be kind of taking these things to task for not living up to the values that we now have, and who are we exactly talking about now? I mean, you're talking about, I don't disagree with any of the, the premises that anyone is talking about. It's just that, I actually don't care if, I don't care about the difference between Robert E. Lee and the Washington statues or any of these things, because what matters to me is not whether they were great men or not, it's how they contribute to the city, what they are as urban objects. And so that's kind of where I come down on this, is that I think that if the more people know about the monuments and obviously the subjects that are involved and the histories of those subjects, the more people will understand. And that if you take them away, people they won't know. I mean, we were talking before about how little people know. You take them away, you put them in a park. I mean, first of all, logistically, talk to some conservators about that, talk to curators about that. It's not that simple a matter. So that's the thing, is that they are irrevocably altered, which most of you want. But that is historically problematic, in my view.
Yeah, I want to maybe ask or think through a kind of meta question, because in the work that I'm doing now, and I'm writing this book called Building Race and Nation, that's looking at the history of American civic architecture. Basically what Michelle Obama said, the fact that the White House was built by enslaved labor. But the other thing I'm interested in is the kind of ideological and literally philosophical embedding of an understanding of racial difference that emerges in the West at a particular moment in time, right? There was understanding that people might encounter each other and recognize they may look different, but the history of race in the West emerges in a particular way at a particular time that produces certain inequalities. race at the time of the Civil War was very different than an understanding of race at the time, let's say, of the Revolutionary War. But nonetheless, those differences are being thought through ideas of what politics is, who can or cannot be a citizen, aesthetic categories. I mean, it's interesting when you start to read Jefferson on his aesthetic description as of blackness, that racial difference isn't just how we engage each other, on a daily basis. It is kind of baked into our modern worldview in so many different calibrated ways that it's really sometimes, I think, difficult to separate how it's operative in all of these things that we are in fact talking about. And so I would just say maybe your aesthetic category already is kind of baked in about concepts of beauty already being racially coded, right? So that we're only able to see certain people in public space. That's why I wanted to present the Douglass, because people, well, that's not beautiful, and therefore blackness can't be in public. So therefore blackness was not in public in many ways. And so I think we have to think historically about how these things are also being generated to produce the inequalities that we still contend with in today.
I would just very quickly add that
I would like to, may I say, I think my fundamental point is that these monuments came to be not as aesthetic exercises. I think that was almost incidental. They were part of an ideological spear. The idea was to discredit and to change the interpretation of the Civil War. I mean, the UDC was very, very clear about that. Black people loved slavery. It civilized them. We're the rightful rulers. What do they need their 15th Amendment rights for? So this is not about aesthetics. I mean, you could order a monument by looking at Confederate Veteran magazine from the Muldoon Monument Company. A lot of them, as Julian was saying, were crap. They were right, and the spike is right there. So this was an ideological thing that they came to be through a profoundly undemocratic process. And I don't think we can forget the terror that was taking place at that time. Now we can say, well, Virginia had the fewest lynchings of all the states in the South, but isn't that a weird way to think about domestic terrorism? That fewer people were being strung up? This was all part of that continuum. It was all part of that white supremacist continuum. It was I mean, if you read the newspapers and the documents from the time, I mean, you do have elites arguing and fighting over who should, be assigned to design the monument, such that General Fitzhugh Lee, the governor of Virginia, had to wade in. But that's incidental because these were all people who had the same mission, and it was white supremacy. Yes, they might have liked nice statues, but again, this was the tip of an ideological spear.
But see, that's where I would say in my opinion, the aesthetics was part and parcel of that ideological project, right? And that's why I don't think you can throw the aesthetics out. Well, it's just no. The concept of beauty, the person who can. Jefferson is very clear that the black cannot understand beauty, right? Does not have the mental capacity to be reasonable, to even have the aesthetic experience, right? So it's baked into the epistemology of Western thought, consciousness, and subjectivity that the African can't experience, right? And that's what I mean. It is baked into a Western worldview. And so we also kind of have to unpack that and not just say the aesthetics is out, but I would argue that the aesthetics is part of the racial project.
And something that should be addressed, very much addressed on site, in my opinion. So that if you remove them from the site, you can't really unpack the kinds of things you're talking about in the same way. And I think that kind of an educational process is really what's needed.
I'm a realist when it comes to public educational projects. And when I agree with Michele in principle, but I think the problem is that's not how they function. People don't read the plaques. They just see, and that's why I talk about it as honoring. They see the monument, it's monument, person, honor. But I also agree with Michele in terms of the importance of the preservation in situ, which I think that every monument that's taken down should be thoroughly photographed in situ so that as historical sources, we in fact do have that documentation. And the advantage to hauling them off to prisoners of war camps is that if something changes, we can put them back. I think the other thing to do, well, you know, things change. The other thing to do, though, to ask ourselves how political this is to see what would happen if thinking about this notion of adding monuments. In Eastern Europe, most big cities have what's called the Liberation Monument. It's the monument that the Soviets built when they liberated the city from the Nazis. The Civil War, as far as the 4 million African Americans living in the South, was a war of liberation. We do not have any monuments in the South, basically to liberation.
You're the Statue of Liberty, that's it.
So
yeah.
you make them.
Well, this is what I'm suggesting. And I think that if we do that, what that will do is uncover the scam. I think we will find out that this is not about aesthetics, it's about politics.
Wait, can I just say one thing? I'm just really perplexed. Wait, just one more thing. It's like, when that war took place, the Nazis made a lot of great monuments too. I mean, they're just beautiful. I mean, they're sexy, tall, really big. We didn't keep them, for context.
But we're not Nazi Germany in 1945. I mean, we're not Germany in 1945.
We're not?
So, no, we're not.
All right,
Not
with
yet.
that, I want.
We're not? I think.
So, I know that we have to move beyond this point in the conversation, but what I'd like to say is there is potential for transformation here. We're at a transformational moment. We're living in Trump's America where denial of this history is what powers our political process, and that's dangerous. I mean, white supremacy is what these things stand for. I understand that there are aesthetic issues and roots, but fundamentally they are being defended. I mean, you've seen the demonstrations and the tiki torches, right? I'm not saying that they should come down. I'm saying that this is a transformative moment where we should be talking about education. We should be talking about reforming curriculum so that people know about contraband slaves, so people know about who Frederick Douglass was. The 328-page Blue Ribbon Commission report from Charlottesville is amazing because what they say is, okay, well, we can remove the monuments and take them to McIntyre Park, or we can do a transformation on site. There are all sorts of different suggestions, but it ain't a plaque. I like Julian's idea, frankly, because I think that represents the violence that these statues represent. I mean, they were erected as sentinels of terrorism. Pretty sentinels of terrorism, but still sentinels of terrorism.
With that, I would like to actually turn it over to questions from the audience. I think our discussion is evolving very organically, but also I want to hear from the audience in the last few minutes here. So we do have 2 microphones in the front here, and in the interest of time, I would encourage folks to be brief and to keep their questions truly questions instead of comments, so that we can hear from a variety of voices from across the community. So with that.
Hi, my name is Aaron Cohen. I'm actually from Charlottesville, Virginia. I was born and raised there my entire life. And I was there at the events on August 11th and 12th. I was feet away from the car crash that killed Heather Heyer and injured dozens. My mother and I were both at the protest, and we were both harassed because we were Jewish, and still that's nothing compared to the harassment that people of color face every day in Charlottesville, in modern society, and also addressing the roots of Charlottesville. For example, Vinegar Hill was a thriving black community in Charlottesville that was demolished and displaced, and people of color actually didn't have a say in that because of the poll taxes in Charlottesville. So my question/statement is somewhat directed towards Dr. Margot. I really appreciate your perspective about changing the context of monuments and how we see them. But what I'm proposing is that that idea might also be a matter of accessibility in regards of that's not Can I finish? A matter of accessibility in terms of how people can actually see things. I know for a lot of people, especially people of color in Charlottesville, it's not possible for them to look at a statue of Robert E. Lee and not see anything but their history of enslavement. And
Can I have you get to your question? I'm sorry. Just
yeah,
we have a lot of people
I'm sorry.
interested.
Okay, I'm trying to talk. What I want to know is how you actually think these statues do contribute to our city, as you said, how the statues could contribute to our city, because as I've seen, the statues, in the way they've contributed recently, has been a catalyst of white supremacy that killed one woman and also killed me.
Thank you. Would anyone like to take that? I think it was, yeah.
What I'm going to say to the young man is what attracted me to the Charlottesville proposal is investing in Vinegar Hill, in investing in the Daughters of Zion Cemetery, African American sites of memory. That is part of this, investing real money. That is part of the context. We can talk about the statues, we should, contextualizing, removal, going to other places, but comprehensive transformation has to be to put this history back together. It was suppressed, right? There's a parallel narrative. There's the triumphal Confederate stuff, and then there's the stuff that we know that we're piecing together by reading the Richmond Planet, by finding other sources that were actually suppressed and nearly erased, like the cemeteries. The cemeteries themselves are outdoor archives that are just wasting away. You have sacred spaces and outdoor archives that we could reclaim today. That's part of the conversation.
Yeah, but public parks and cemeteries are two different things. You know, that's a humanity, one. But I mean, a cemetery should not be mistaken for a public square. There's no comparison between, a private, intimate cemetery that tells the story of lives lost. Having a statue in a public square in front of a courthouse, you can't even compare those two objects. One has sanctity and one is propaganda.
Well, I would say that they're both sites of memory and contemplation. There may be additional functions in one, but also in terms of funding,
so
like
the statue of
different.
Lee is on his deathbed, or is it on? It's like the bench where he slept. Is it?
Actually, they change.
Yeah.
They do.
Yeah.
The statues of Lee start out. Actually, they do start out with him lying down, and then they end up with him standing up. So there actually is a change.
Really?
Yes.
Yes. And just the question of cemeteries actually historically were public spaces. So, the very famous landscape cemeteries are actually quite that. But I did want to respond to the question from the, I would just say I'm really, basically proud that you went to you went home to protest. I've been working on a memorial to enslaved African Americans at UVA on grounds. One of our collaborators actually was one of the authors of that report, Frank Dukes, who's an environmental mediator, a really extraordinary person. And I would just say that project started because students got involved and made institutions accountable. And so you can be an incredibly powerful voice for change. And I would just encourage you to stay involved and make your elders and the institutions of power accountable, because you can actually enact change and catalyze people to own up to and be involved with the transformation of our shared built environment.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your question as well. So with that, if I can turn to this microphone then for the next question.
Yes.
Please, as short as possible.
Yes, in light of what you were talking about earlier about removing these monuments, how does this affect the Artists' Rights Act of 1990, particularly the morality clause, which protects all works of art, public art, from removal and destruction and change of any kind? Doesn't this violate the rights of artists? And could this be a conflict of interest in helping to hopefully erase racism? You're also taking away the rights of artists and eliminating their history as well.
Well, I think I get your question. And the works that are, I think, in question here probably don't fall under that act, but the implications of this idea that you can just remove things because they don't adhere to your own political or ideological perspective is problematic for, for contemporary artists. In other words,
That's called democracy.
well, except that there are contractual issues involved. I mean, I'm coming at it to some extent from a kind of clinical, practical, pragmatic perspective. But when an artist creates something as a permanent work of art, he or she expects it to stay in place. And I mean, so the problem with Richard Serra, that was protested, but from now.
And Lee, like one.
No, so I'm saying I look at all of this as the process and not as this issue of whether they're good guys or bad guys.
They're different animals. It's like one's like.
I'm not sure about that particular law, but I do know that there's an injunction against removing the statues in Charlottesville. States have passed laws against removing war memorials, and that is being contested at very high levels. But again, I think that a lot of these monuments were the results of public funding and public processes, and I don't know, as Mya said, I don't think they would fall under that.
Well, thank you very much for your question. If I can turn to this microphone for the next question. Thank you.
My name is Christian. I live in the Bronx. Every morning I have to cross under the Bruckner Expressway, which was built by Robert Moses, power broker of 1900s New York City. And it's such a pain to cross that it's a highway, basically. You have to cross this thing. And it's like a monument to this guy's ego, basically. And so when you, right now, it's like under construction. The Bruckner right now is like in tatters, and it's like really crazy to see this this other monument kind of like messed up. It reminded me about like Hans Haacke did a piece I think in the 1980s, where he was given the German pavilion in the Venice Biennial, and what he did was that he jackhammered the floor. The German pavilion was built by the Nazis, and it's like a beautiful artwork. And it also—
Is there a question
in
this?
So,
okay.
And in Cleveland, in front of the Cleveland Museum, there's the Brothers of Rodin statue that was blown up by, I think, the Weathermen or some type of revolutionary group. And here, this is like this statue with a new history. So I'm asking Dr. Bogart, like, what she thinks about, like, what happens, like, can there be like a new history to these things? I don't understand why you advocate, like, for nothing to happen to these monuments. I don't know.
I'm having trouble actually hearing what you're saying because of the microphone. It's not that your voice isn't loud enough. I'm having trouble with—
So was the question, are there—
Just like what, there's a new history that happens when monuments are destroyed, and I'm wondering why you're advocating for like the old history to stay, to be like the, like, I don't know, like the thing that you see when
I'll just say that very simply because I have, that's what I was saying at the beginning. I've studied, I study monuments as part of a history of the city. So I have a particular take on these works that comes out of that, and it, on some level, levels what is being commemorated. You know, the sculpture itself, I don't care if it's good art. I care about how it got there, and I do a lot of very detailed work to try to understand that. So to me, I can't walk around the city and look at monuments without seeing something meaningful in them. And so that's why I defend them. I also defend them because I'm part of a group of people that assesses proposals for conservation of monuments, and that's my pro bono job. I do that to, you know, I protect monuments as part of a mission that I have.
All right, if we can turn it to the other question, thank you.
Thank you. And
if we
I
can
actually,
keep it brief.
I got an actual question. I'd like to ask the panel, Gettysburg. Thank you.
Okay, so Gettysburg has many, many monuments to individual military units, Confederate and Union or Federal. So this is a commemoration of those particular units. Bryan Stevenson, you all know Bryan Stevenson, author of Just Mercy, Equal Justice Initiative. I mean, he has a pretty good, useful taxonomy. I mean, there are those monuments that commemorate battles and commemorate the loss of particular units, and that's what we do with military history. It's not glorifying, it's not reducing the value of the people who are being excluded, which is precisely what these monuments do. At their cellular level, they are about racism and white supremacy. That's how they got there. It wasn't any, complex contextual thing. I mean, the process itself might have been complex, but if you have all the power to make decisions, if you have exclusive claim on the public purse, you can make your ideology, you can make your biases granite and marble, and that's precisely what happened. And just to finish up, this is a transformative moment. Keep tearing them down, keep them up, whatever. No, this is a moment where we have to, as they say these days, surface this history. The full history. I know who built the particular monuments. It doesn't matter because the people who paid them commissioned them to erect monuments to white supremacy. It wasn't primarily aesthetic. That's what they were doing.
I think that there is a way in which actually all of us agree. And that is, and it goes back to the United Daughters of the Confederacy, because when they paid for the monuments and lobbied to have them put in public places, they also wrote textbooks. Yes. They wrote lesson plans. Yep. They transformed the understanding of the history of the 19th century. And I think what we all agree is that the issue here is how do we best educate ourselves and the American public, whether it's with the monuments in situ, moved, whatever, how communities decide how their people will educate themselves. But I think we all agree that the highest priority here is to think about how we educate one another in thinking about the past.
I also want to give the other panelists an option to disagree.
Just I'm curious about Gettysburg. Maybe answer the question. Nobody actually answered.
We're going to move on to just
How about they lost?
one more question here. So actually, if I can take a question here from the student.
They lost.
I just want to remind you that we're trying to keep a civil conversation here as well, so please let us move on. Thank you very much.
Okay. Hi there. Thank you for speaking tonight. I guess my statement is going to be in response to Dr. Grossman, and you were saying earlier that it was you were more uncertain of Jefferson and other monuments of those sorts being erected and maintained for their historical purposes. But I think, and for me, I'm seeing them as still being a permissible action to have them erected and for what they represent. So I guess my question is more in the response of education. How do we, outside of just like textbook learning and within school, show a more active display of the action, of being against the actions that these historic figures have stood for? Because I guess I'm riffing more off of, Julian, that you were saying that destruction is the best kind of art. I feel like these should be taken down in a very vicious and active way so that we can send a message that what these people had stood for, it's not correct, it's not right in what we stand for as Americans. But
I think that unless we start going all over the country tearing things down, we have to decide where a line might exist. And first of all, I think the line exists, again, it goes back to communities making decisions that are historically informed. One of the best statements on this comes from the Association for the Study of African American History and Life. Their statement on it is absolutely superb. And what they say is that Jefferson and Washington accomplished something. What they accomplished was deeply flawed, but they accomplished something.
That is
Lee
absolutely
and
true.
Jackson accomplished nothing.
I'm not denying that.
So that's the distinction.
I see that, but in having that monument, for the common American that sees these, they're not going to have that connection to their complicated history because those things that are eliminated within the school system. So
the issue is where you have something that's reasonably straightforward, which is Confederacy, and where you have complexity. People are going to argue reasonably about Columbus, Washington, Jefferson. Me, 100 years from now. One of the things historians do is we learn humility. And he is without sin can cast the first stone. And it is very difficult to sit here and live in judgment of people in the past and start tearing down monuments. We want to do that slowly. And what I'm suggesting is the distinction lies between people who did something that perhaps is worthy of honor and people who did not do anything worthy of honor. That seems to me to be a reasonable line to draw.
But when you,
in reality,
when you talk to the sons of Confederate veterans, they are honoring their ancestors, they were defending their homes. So they would make the argument that Stonewall Jackson, all these folks did something honorable. I would say you have the USA and you have the CSA, right? So why are we erecting monuments to the CSA? Why are we keeping those monuments? What, you know, I mean, that's the conversation I think that we can be having. Jefferson, Washington, slave owning, so on and so forth. That's not the conversation. I think the conversation is this political entity, this economic entity that rebelled in its own secession documents said, we're rebelling because of slavery, because you're threatening our right to own slaves. CSA, not USA.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of Jefferson, I mean, that's what's been fascinating working on this memorial to the enslaved laborers at UVA, to the, this is Jefferson's monument to his vision, essentially, was to build this university in brick and marble by enslaved labor. But the narrative, the history that's told, had completely erased to some extent that present, or certainly diminished the present. So what has been fascinating, now that students had gotten the ball rolling, is that the university recognized it literally needed to excavate and unearth that history, retag certain things, produce new narratives, maps, new educational projects. I mean, it is trying to do precisely what the Confederate daughters essentially did, but to its own historical narrative, which is quite powerful, so that visitors coming there now know, students are now finding out. And so it's recasting the history without necessarily taking it apart physically, brick by brick, which wouldn't work in this case because people actually do use those buildings, but actually changing literally the landscape by putting this very large monument right at its feet. So I think it is possible, but I do think, we change. We as a collective memory, in terms of what we understand, is transformative. So.
Thank you for your responses. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And so one last question actually here from Marissa.
So thank you all for your dialogue around this issue. I have a question around James and Julian's proposals or possible proposals of building these parks where Confederate monuments would be either in a prisoner of war space or all together in the space of Georgia. And how would you essentially keep those sites, even if you take the sculptures off of pedestals, how would you keep those sites from essentially becoming sites of pilgrimage for white supremacists?
Well, I think the short answer is without public education, you can't. There are already hundreds of such pilgrimage places across the country. We just don't want them to be public anymore. So without this robust public education that has to happen, and I'm not entirely sure that this should just simply be a matter of let's have a referendum about the statues. I think that it behooves every state that has these monuments to do a thorough study such as Charlottesville did. Virginia, the state, not so much. Their report was 49 pages and they basically punked. Charlottesville did the hard work and they named the problem. So I think you're right. I mean, we could send all these statues back to the UDC and they could basically claim victory, right? We have our statues back, screw you. That's not transformative. Like, this is a public conversation that must happen. Mitch Landrieu did the right thing when he pulled the monuments down. He didn't just pull them down at, in in the dark of night, although that happened, he issued a statement saying precisely what they stood for: domestic terrorism, the equivalent of burning a cross on someone's lawn. The monuments are lies. As Brian Stevenson would say, these lies are embedded in our landscape, and we have to deal with them as such.
But they're also... Sorry, I could go on.
I actually think Mabel has answered your question, because I think what Mabel described at the University of Virginia is what I would imagine Stone Mountain would look like. That the University of Virginia has demonstrated that you can take, in essence, a site that symbolizes the work of a slaveholder and do the kinds of educational work that's required, whether it's building additional monuments, whether it's doing other sorts of things that are educative. It's basically creating context. And so I think in any of these places, whether it's the POW camps or wherever, you can create the kind of context that Mabel has described at the University of Virginia, which I think works.
Exactly. You do things that complement all of the negative stuff, and I think, you know, your project to me it's a no-brainer. That's what people should be engaging with, rather than, you know, trying to tear things down. I mean, not everybody thinks they should be torn down, whereas you have an opportunity to try to educate people, yes, about those monuments, but also to counteract what they represent by doing something different and doing something unexpected to most, to many people, and really literally sort of putting one's money where one's mouth is. So that to me is absolutely crucial, these complementary interventions.
Do you want to comment on your proposal? One last note, Julian.
I still think that I'm totally perplexed. I went to the School of Art here, and nobody in this School of Art for 100 years has made bronze social realistic figuration. You know, the last sculptor that did that was Adolf Weinman. He did the eagles that there's one kicking around here. It was on the old Penn Station. I mean, that's design. So what if we all of a sudden just said this was design? Like, this isn't art. This isn't like some piece of our cultural fabric, or this isn't like a shard of the true cross. These things aren't sacred.
No, they're not.
So they're obsolete. It's like if your telephone booth on the corner isn't working anymore, you trade it out for something that does.
Well, with that, these ideas that these things are not sacred, I think we'll end tonight. So thank you all very much to our 5 panelists for a lively discussion tonight. And thank you all very much for your questions and your presence.